Hey folks, Jason Garbus here from Numberline Security. Today, we're going to be going through a new document that came out of the US federal government called the Federal Zero Trust Data Security Strategy. Now, this is interesting. This was created by a committee of practitioners, CISOs, and data officers. And what it does is it analyzes the data pillar, of course, but specifically, how do you apply zero trust principles to your data security problems? And data security is absolutely a set of problems and not one single problem. So what I want to do is take a few minutes to go through the document. I found this really useful to read. Some of this is, I would say, generic motherhood and apple pie, zero trust is great type of background, which is necessary if you're new to it. And then it talks about there's some really good, interesting elements in here of, I would say, pretty concrete advice about how to approach things. Now, it stops a little bit short of actually being, I would say, a playbook, and that's probably going to be the next thing that we need to focus on. So I'm going to share my screen here. We're going to talk through this for a few minutes, and I do encourage you to read this document. It's not that long. It's an easy read. It's not super technical. All right, so let's get started. You can see this came out just last month in October. And if we look at the contents here, so obviously introduction, they talk about defining the data. So doing a data inventory, understanding what that looks like in your environment. We'll talk about that. They talk about securing the data, which of course is a big piece of this. This chapter 4, managing the data, is a placeholder. And then there's a conclusion and the wrap up. So let's go through this. There's a few specific things that I want to talk through briefly here. So first of all, this stuff is the motherhood and apple pie. I talked about how important data management is to zero trust, some definitions of zero trust. Most of us really understand all of this. What I do want to talk about is here on this page. So they have the stages of a zero trust data security roadmap. But you can see, if I make this a little bit bigger, discover, inventory, categorize, and label your data, of course, but also the data flows. And this is not just about, okay, I have this data, whether it's structured or unstructured, it's how is this data accessed? And this can go, of course, be through users directly accessing data. It can be an application that's accessing structured data in a database. But then there are other elements to it, like system-to-system API access to data. There's data backup. Is this data getting sent into or put into a data lake for analysis? Is it getting moved into an AI tool? There's many, many ways that data can I won't say escape, but be accessed and be moved around. It's very different than access to an application. If we think about in the zero trust world, applications are much more fixed and we have complete control of them. And you can't clone an application or copy an application in an email and send it to someone, whereas data, of course, is completely different than that. So this is why data and data security is a much more challenging problem. So if we think about this, there's obviously step one, discovering, inventory, categorizing your data, understanding the risk analysis on that associated with the data. Then align with your zero trust architecture, design your controls and monitoring. So I feel like this is just kind of missing one piece of this, which is the transaction flows or the access pathways. How is this data actually used? And in some cases, that's going to be pretty straightforward, like it's in a relational database. The only way to get access to it is through an application, and we have user roles in the application. That's pretty straightforward and very, I would say, much easier to control versus data that's unstructured. It's in a spreadsheet or a document. It's emailed around. It's copied. Those are very different because there aren't well-defined transaction flows associated with it, and that data is often put into just file systems or SharePoints or sharing sites or things like that. So a lot more challenging. All right, chapter 2, where you define the data. There's a lot of emphasis here, not surprisingly, on the federal aspect of things. So this document is primarily intended at federal agencies. So there's a lot in here on utilizing federally defined data classification schemes. So we're not going to talk about that, especially if you're in the private sector. But clearly, you do need to have a scheme for understanding and categorizing your data, even if it's just a very simple, 2 or 3 categories of super sensitive, a little bit sensitive, and not sensitive, to help you understand what sort of controls you need around that data in your environment. Okay, so Chapter three, securing the data, of course, is where the rubber meets the road here, right? This is actually what we're trying to do. And there's a couple things I wanted to point out that I thought was interesting. So first is really it's this piece here. This paragraph, these couple of paragraphs is actually really important. Is that data teams and security teams can mutually benefit from a collaborative relationship, and this is really important, right? You as security leaders need to understand. Hopefully, number one, do you have data stewards or data owners in your environment, in your enterprise? Are they empowered? Do they understand that that actually is their role, or is it sort of ignored? I'm an application owner. I care about the business process or achieving the business mission. And if I don't view myself as a data steward, that's a problem that we have to address because data is such an important element of what our enterprises are trying to secure and get value out of. So this is where, number one, I think it's important to have an assessment of the level of maturity in your organization around data stewardship, and also assuming that there's some level of that right, within the application owner or data management team. As a security professional, reach out to them, collaborate them, understands the totality of how this data is used, how it should be used, how the business wants it to be used, and the value that can come out of it. And more importantly is, look, you don't know what you don't know. So listen, get your ears on for understanding the challenges and approaches in the data space. In particular, thinking about when you are going to begin to impose some controls around data, how it's accessed, how it's used, how it's shared, how it's created, et cetera, that those controls are going to flow through to end users, to business users, to partners. And you want to make sure that you're not just imposing controls that are going to put a monkey wrench into the works here, that you're doing it in a way that balances out user productivity with security and with confidentiality and privacy, et cetera. And in particular, when you're looking at data categorization, that you can hopefully rely more on automated analysis versus manual analysis, especially for that large pool of data that might exist in just a big pile today that hasn't been categorized. One other piece I wanted to talk about is here in section 3.6, which is identity, credential, and access management, or ICAM. So this is really important. Of course, Zero Trust is all about understanding identity, understanding attributes of those identities, and then building policies that use those to control access to data. And this is called out here pretty nicely, where they introduce this table where, of course, they define RBAC, they define attribute-based access control, and then really where we're going for is this notion of, excuse me, context-based access control. And really, I think this is a great line here. CBAC combines features of RBAC and ABAC to apply dynamic access policies using device-level signals and cues. So I really view context-based access control is absolutely the right way to do this. And part of the context are roles and attributes of users, of course, which come from the identity system. But this is the right way to think about this. And really, we want to get to a point where we have the capabilities in our environment to impose data visible, data aware controls that utilize context to make those decisions. A simple example is if this data is going to be constrained by European GDPR regulations, and the conclusion is people outside the European Union can't view this data, clearly our data solution, our overall security solution, needs to be aware of where the identity is at this point in time to make a decision. Oh, this person is in Europe, they can view this data. This person is not in Europe, they can't view this data as a very kind of basic but important control capability. And that requires context to be made visible to the control point or the application that is actually handling the data and then having the ability to enforce whether that identity can see the data at that point in time. Okay, we mentioned that Chapter 4, Manage the Data, is a placeholder. So that's to come. You can see here that they're going to develop that in future versions of this document. And then in Chapter 5, in the conclusion, just to wrap up here, these are great things, right? Cross-functional collaboration is important. Cooperative relationship with data and security teams. This is not a zero-sum game. This is not adversarial. It needs to be, let's work together to improve our data security while maintaining and ideally enabling better user productivity. Let's as an industry work together to learn and educate ourselves on how to do things in the industry today. So, like I said, it's worth reading this document. There's some good nuggets in there, and I like the overall philosophy, and especially if there are challenge in your organization around identifying data stewardship and increasing the overall maturity, this document can be a really useful starting point. Even though it's targeted at the federal agencies and you may be in the private sector, it's nonetheless useful. Now, what's missing here, of course, is I would say, let's call it a playbook, something that is really specific and says, okay, here's an example of a different type, a certain type of application or data source, and here's how a specific set of controls might be applied to it. Now, I know this is hard to do without getting into the specifics of a vendor product, which these types of documents clearly can't do. But I think that needs to come in the industry, and I got some things percolated around this. So watch this space for really getting the specifics in terms of, okay, here's how you can do this, and make it practical in your environment. Stopping short of saying buy a tool from vendor X, because we don't want to go there. So I hope you found this helpful. I found this document useful. Thank you, and have a great day.